The galaxy had known peace for 12,000 years. Hundreds of alien species lived together under the rule of the Galactic Concord. They traded with each other. They shared knowledge. They built great stations among the stars. War was a thing of the distant past, a dark memory that no living being could recall. The laws that governed this peace were ancient. They had been written on tablets of pure crystal by a civilization called the First Ones. No one knew who the First Ones were. They had vanished long before any current species learned to walk upright. But their laws remained. Their wisdom guided the galaxy. And their warnings were never ignored. Commander Daniel Carter had served in space for 20 years. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and tired lines around his eyes. His ship, the Resolute, was not a warship. It was an exploration vessel, built to map the unknown regions at the edge of Concord space. His crew of 32 men and women had become like family to him. They had seen wonders together, strange planets with purple skies, moons made entirely of ice that sang when the sun hit them, creatures that lived in the vacuum of space itself. But nothing had prepared them for what they would find on that ordinary Tuesday. Lisa Morgan was the first to notice the signal. She sat at her communications station, her red hair tied back in a practical bun, her fingers moving across the controls with practiced ease. The signal was weak and strange. It did not match any known transmission type. She called the commander to her station and showed him what she had found. Kevin Brooks, the chief engineer, joined them moments later. He was a large man with hands that could fix anything, and a mind that never stopped working. He studied the signal and shook his head in confusion. It was coming from an asteroid field that was not supposed to exist. Their charts showed nothing but empty space in that region. Ambassador Zyrith watched them work with his compound eyes. He was Kelvani, an insectoid species that stood 7 feet tall and moved with unsettling grace. The Concord had assigned him to observe human activities in the Outer Rim. He did not trust humans. Few aliens did. Humans were new to the galactic community. They had only achieved faster-than-light travel 200 years ago. They were loud and curious and sometimes reckless, but they were also members of the Concord now, and Zyrith took his duties seriously. Daniel made a decision. They would investigate the signal. His crew prepared for the journey with quiet efficiency. Within an hour, the Resolute was moving through the darkness toward the unknown. The asteroid field appeared on their sensors like a ghost. One moment there was nothing. The next moment, thousands of rocks filled the space ahead. Kevin swore under his breath. This was impossible. Asteroid fields did not simply appear. Something was hiding this place from detection. They navigated carefully through the tumbling rocks. Lisa kept tracking the signal, guiding them deeper into the field. After 2 hours of careful flying, they found the source. It was not an asteroid. It was a structure, a massive door built into a rock the size of a small moon. The metal was black and covered with symbols that glowed with faint blue light. Zyrith made a sound that might have been a gasp. He recognized those symbols. They were the language of the First Ones. This was one of their archives, sealed for longer than any species could remember. The Concord had found 3 other archives over the millennia. Each one had contained knowledge that changed the galaxy forever. This was a discovery that would make them all famous. Daniel assembled a landing team. He chose Lisa for her language skills, and Kevin for his technical expertise. Zyrith insisted on coming. The ambassador claimed it was his duty to observe. Daniel suspected it was simple curiosity. They suited up and took a shuttle down to the massive door. The symbols responded to their presence. The blue light grew brighter. Something scanned them. Ancient machines waking from a sleep of countless centuries. Then, the door opened. It moved without sound, sliding into the rock as if it weighed nothing at all. Beyond it was darkness. They walked into the archive with their lights cutting through the black. The chamber inside was enormous. The ceiling disappeared into shadows far above their heads. Walls of dark stone stretched in every direction, covered with carvings and symbols and images of beings that no longer existed. The air was cold and still. It tasted old. Lisa began translating the symbols on the walls. Most of them spoke of events from the distant past. Wars that had been fought before the current stars were born. Species that had risen and fallen and been forgotten. The first ones had recorded everything. They had watched the galaxy for millions of years. Kevin found a power source that still functioned. He connected his equipment to it and brought light flooding into the chamber. Now, they could see the full scope of what surrounded them. Thousands of prophecies carved into stone, warnings about cosmic events, predictions about the rise and fall of civilizations. The first ones had not just recorded the past, they had seen the future. Xyrith found the sealed section first. It was set apart from the rest, protected by energy barriers that hummed with clear warning. The symbols around it were different from the others. They pulsed with an urgent red light. Whatever was written there, the first ones had wanted to make sure no one missed it. Lisa worked on the translation while the others watched. Her face grew pale as she read. Her hands began to shake. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She told them what the prophecy said. It spoke of a species born on a world of death. A planet so hostile that survival itself was an achievement. This species would be shaped by endless conflict. They would be aggressive and stubborn and impossible to stop. They would spread across the stars like fire through dry grass. And they would be the last thing the galaxy would ever fear. Below the warning were coordinates. Lisa checked them twice to make sure she had translated correctly. Then she checked them a third time because she could not believe what she was seeing. The coordinates pointed to a small yellow star in an unremarkable spiral arm. The third planet from that star was called Earth. Xyrith collapsed to his knees. His compound eyes were wide with an emotion that humans would recognize as terror. The prophecy was talking about humans. The ancient first ones, with all their wisdom and power, had looked into the future and seen humanity coming, and they had been afraid. Daniel stood in that ancient chamber and felt the weight of what they had discovered pressing down on him. His species had been marked as a threat before they even existed. The galaxy had been warned about them for 12,000 years. Everything was about to change. The question now was simple. What would the Concord do with this knowledge? And what would it mean for every human among the stars? The news traveled faster than light itself. Within 3 days, every species in the Galactic Concord knew about the discovery. An ancient prophecy from the first ones, a warning about humanity. The story spread through trade routes and diplomatic channels and whispered conversations in dark corners of space stations. Fear spread with it. The High Council called an emergency session at Nexus Prime. This station was the oldest in the Concord, built around a star that had burned since before life existed on most worlds. Representatives from every major species made the journey. Some traveled for weeks to attend. This was too important to miss. The fate of an entire species would be decided in that ancient hall. Admiral Marcus Grant represented humanity at the council. He was 60 years old, with a face carved from stone and eyes that had seen too much war. His career had taken him from the slums of Chicago to the highest ranks of human military command. He had fought pirates and negotiated treaties and buried too many friends along the way. Now he faced the greatest challenge of his life. He had to defend his entire species against a prophecy written before they existed. Dr. Amy Sullivan walked beside him as they entered the council chamber. She was the foremost expert on alien archaeology in human space. Her work had helped humans understand a dozen species. Her books were read on 100 worlds. She had spent her life building bridges between humans and aliens. Now those bridges were burning. The chamber was a vast dome filled with floating platforms. Each platform held representatives from a different species. Some were humanoid. Others were not. There were beings made of light and beings made of stone. Creatures with wings and creatures with tentacles. The diversity of life in the galaxy was on full display, and all of it was staring at the two humans with suspicion and fear. High Arbiter Velmora spoke first. She was Sindari, a species that existed as pure energy contained in crystalline forms. Her body flickered with agitation as she addressed the assembly. She recited the words of the prophecy in a voice that rang through the chamber. She spoke of humans as destroyers, as conquerors, as a plague that would spread across the stars and consume everything in its path. She pointed to human history as evidence. The wars, the genocides, the weapons of mass destruction created before humans even left their own world. She demanded action. She demanded that humanity be contained before the prophecy could come true. Marcus listened without expression. He had expected this. He had prepared for it. When Velmora finished speaking, he rose from his platform and faced the assembly. His voice was calm and steady. He did not deny human history. He acknowledged the wars and the violence and the terrible things his species had done to itself. But he also spoke of other things. He spoke of art and music and literature. He spoke of humans who had given their lives to save strangers. He spoke of the hospitals humans had built on alien worlds, and the disasters they had helped clean up, and the hands they had extended in friendship to every species they encountered. Humans were capable of destruction, but they were also capable of love and sacrifice and hope. Representative Kryn of the Vorthak Dominion interrupted him with a hiss. The Vorthak were reptilian beings, with scales like armor and teeth like knives. They had been warriors once. Before the conquered brought peace, Kryn accused humans of being too dangerous to trust. He pointed out that humans had developed nuclear weapons before they achieved spaceflight. What kind of species created the power to destroy their own world before they could even leave it? Amy stepped forward to respond. Her voice was soft but firm. She reminded the assembly that humans had created those weapons during a time of great fear. And when the fear passed, they chose not to use them. They built treaties and agreements and systems to prevent their use. The weapons still existed, but so did the choice not to use them. That choice, she argued, was what made humans different. They knew their own capacity for destruction, and they fought against it every single day. The debate continued for hours. Species that had never agreed on anything found common ground in their fear of humanity. Others argued for patience and understanding. Old alliances shifted. New ones formed. The future of the galaxy hung in the balance. Then Elder Morath rose to speak. The chamber fell silent. Morath was Celestine, a species so old that they had watched the birth of stars. His body was withered and frail, but his eyes burned with ancient wisdom. He had studied the first ones his entire life. He had read more of their writings than any being alive. When he spoke, even the High Arbiter listened. Morath moved slowly to the center of the chamber. He acknowledged the fear that filled the room. He understood it. The prophecy was terrifying. But he asked the assembly to consider something they had overlooked. They had focused so completely on the warning that they had ignored what came after. He activated a holographic display. The final lines of the prophecy appeared in glowing symbols above their heads. Amy translated them aloud for the humans in the room. The words spoke of a darkness that would come from beyond the void. A threat older than the galaxy itself. When this darkness arrived, the prophecy said, only one species would stand against it. Only one species would fight. Only one species would remain. The symbols were clear. That species was humanity. The chamber erupted in chaos. Representatives shouted over each other. Some demanded to know if this was true. Others accused Morath of lying. The Vorthak representative stormed out in fury. The Sindari flickered so violently that she nearly lost cohesion. Marcus stood still in the middle of the storm. He looked at Amy and saw his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. The prophecy did not warn against humans. It warned of what would happen without them. The first ones had seen something coming, something terrible, and they had known that only humanity would be able to stop it. Morath waited for the chaos to subside. Then he spoke again, in a voice heavy with age and sorrow. He told the assembly that he did not know when the darkness would come. It could be tomorrow. It could be in 1,000 years. But it would come. The first ones had never been wrong. The council ended without a decision. The representatives returned to their homeworlds to debate and argue and worry. Some began preparing for war against humanity. Others began wondering what threat could be so terrible that the galaxy would need human help to survive it. Marcus and Amy returned to their ship in silence. They had bought time. Nothing more. The galaxy still feared them. But now, there was a seed of doubt in that fear. A question that demanded an answer. What was coming? And would humanity be ready when it arrived? 3 months passed in uneasy silence. The Concord remained divided. Some species strengthened their borders against humanity. Others waited and watched. Trade continued. Life went on, but everyone felt it. A tension in the air, a sense that something was about to break. The first colony to fall was called New Harmony. It was a Kelvani settlement on the very edge of conquered space. 10,000 souls living on a green world with 3 moons. One morning, all communication from New Harmony simply stopped. No distress call, no warning, just silence where there had been life. The Concord sent a scout ship to investigate. It never returned. They sent a second ship with better sensors and a larger crew. It broadcast images for exactly 47 seconds before its signal died. Those images showed something that made seasoned admirals turn pale, ships that looked like they had been grown rather than built, hulls of twisted metal and organic matter pulsing with dark energy, and creatures moving within them, shadows given form, nightmares made real. The harvesters had arrived. No one knew where they came from. Their ships emerged from the void between galaxies, a place where nothing was supposed to exist. They did not communicate. They did not negotiate. They simply consumed. Entire worlds vanished under their assault. Species that had existed for millions of years were wiped out in hours. The harvesters fed on consciousness itself. They took everything that made a being alive and left only empty husks behind. The Concord assembled the largest battle fleet in its history. 300 warships from 20 different species gathered to meet the threat. Admiral Vorthax, the finest military mind the Kelvani had ever produced, commanded the fleet. He had never lost a battle. He had never known fear. He watched the Harvester Armada approach on his view screen and felt both for the first time. The battle lasted 11 minutes. The Concord fleet was destroyed. Admiral Vorthax died with his hand on his weapon controls, firing until his ship came apart around him. Only 17 vessels escaped to tell the tale. 300 ships reduced to 17 in less time than it took to eat a meal. Panic swept across the galaxy. Species that had not known war for thousands of years suddenly faced extinction. The Kelvani sealed their homeworld behind the strongest shields they could build. The Sindari retreated to a dimension only they could access. The Vorthak demanded that someone do something, but they had no suggestions about what that something should be. The Concord was paralyzed by fear. Captain Samantha Price was not paralyzed. She commanded the destroyer, Relentless, a human warship assigned to protect supply lines in the Outer Rim. When the harvesters attacked a refugee convoy she was escorting, she did not run. She could not run. 12 transport ships carried 50,000 civilians from species that had once called humanity a threat. Now those civilians were screaming for help on every channel. Samantha was 34 years old. She had grown up on a farm in Kansas and joined the Navy to see the stars. Her crew of 43 men and women trusted her with their lives. She gathered them on the bridge and told them the truth. They were outgunned. They were outmatched. They were probably going to die. But those transports needed time to escape, and the Relentless was the only ship that could give it to them. Not a single crew member asked to leave. The Relentless engaged the Harvester attack ship at close range. Human weapons were not designed to fight something like this. Energy beams that could cut through asteroid rock barely scratched the enemy hull. Missiles detonated against organic armor that simply grew back. The Harvester ship was 10 times their size and armed with weapons that seemed to bend reality itself. Samantha ordered her crew to the escape pods. Most of them refused. They stayed at their stations, fighting until their consoles exploded around them. The chief engineer kept the engines running with nothing but willpower and spare parts. The weapons officer fired until her guns melted from the heat. When the Relentless could no longer fight, Samantha made her final decision. She aimed her dying ship at the center of the Harvester vessel, at the pulsing core where she could see shadows moving behind organic membranes. She pushed the engines beyond their limits. Warning lights filled the bridge with red. The hull screamed as it began to tear apart. The Relentless struck the Harvester ship at maximum speed. The explosion lit up the darkness of space for 1,000,000 miles. When the light faded, the harvester ship was still there. But it was wounded. Its organic hull had cracked. Dark fluid leaked into the void. The shadows inside writhed in something that might have been pain. For the first time in their endless existence, the harvesters had been hurt. A single human ship, crewed by 43 people who refused to abandon strangers, had done what 300 Concorde warships could not. They had proven that the enemy could bleed. The refugee transports escaped. 50,000 lives saved because one captain and her crew decided that some things were worth dying for. When the survivors reached safety, they told everyone what had happened. The story spread faster than the harvester advance. Alien species watched recordings of the Relentless making its final charge. They saw human faces in the footage, calm and determined, even as death approached. They heard Samantha's last words broadcast across all frequencies. She had said something simple, something that needed no translation. She had said that humanity did not abandon people. Not ever. Elder Morath watched the recordings in his chamber on Nexus Prime. His ancient eyes saw what others missed. Human ships did not fight like Concorde ships. They did not retreat when the battle turned against them. They did not calculate odds or measure acceptable losses. They simply fought until they could not fight anymore. And sometimes, that was enough. The prophecy had called humans dangerous. It had called them relentless. It had warned that they would never stop. Now the galaxy was beginning to understand what that really meant. Humans did not just refuse to stop fighting their enemies. They refused to stop fighting for anyone who needed them. The harvesters were coming. The Concorde was falling. But somewhere in the darkness, a new hope was being born. Its name was humanity. The galaxy was burning. Every day brought news of another world lost, another species scattered to the void. Refugees filled every station and outpost. Beings who had never spoken to each other huddled together in cramped corridors, united by terror. The harvesters moved through Concorde space like a storm that never ended. Their fleet grew larger with each victory. Their hunger seemed infinite, but something else was growing too, something the harvesters had never encountered before: resistance. Admiral Marcus Grant stood before the Reformed Council at Nexus Prime. The chamber looked different now. Many platforms stood empty, their occupants dead or fled, but those who remained had set aside their old fears. The prophecy that had made them distrust humanity now gave them hope. If the first ones said humans could fight this darkness, then humans would lead the fight. Marcus did not look like a savior. He looked tired. His uniform was wrinkled. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. He had spent weeks coordinating evacuation efforts, moving civilians to safety while the military bought time with blood. He had watched good people die. He had ordered others to their deaths. The weight of it all pressed down on him like a physical force. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. He told the council that the harvesters were not gods. They were not invincible. They could be hurt. Captain Price had proven that. Her sacrifice had shown them the way. The enemy was powerful, but power was not everything. The harvesters had never faced an opponent that refused to accept defeat. They had never fought beings who would die to protect strangers. They had never known humanity. The plan Marcus proposed was simple in concept and difficult in execution. Every species would contribute what they could. Kelvani engineers would work with human scientists to understand harvester technology. Sindari navigators would map safe routes through contested space. Vorthak warriors would fight alongside human soldiers. Old rivalries would be forgotten. Old prejudices would be buried. Survival demanded nothing less. Dr. Amy Sullivan led the research effort. She assembled teams from 12 different species, each bringing unique knowledge and perspective. They studied fragments of harvester ships recovered from battlefields. They analyzed energy signatures and communication patterns. They worked around the clock in laboratories scattered across a dozen stations. Amy pushed herself harder than anyone. She barely slept. She forgot to eat. Her colleagues worried about her health, but she could not stop. Every hour of delay meant more lives lost. Every breakthrough brought them closer to victory. When she finally collapsed from exhaustion, she was unconscious for only 6 hours before dragging herself back to work. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison became the face of human resistance. He was a pilot, young and handsome with a quick smile that seemed impossible given the circumstances. His squadron had been among the first to engage the harvesters after the initial disaster. They had lost half their number in the first week, but they had also learned. They had adapted. They had found ways to hurt the enemy that no one else had tried. Jake led the first successful raid on a harvester processing ship. These massive vessels followed the main fleet, collecting the consciousness of captured beings for purposes no one wanted to imagine. When Jake's squadron detected one separated from the main force, he saw an opportunity. The raid should have been suicide, 12 fighters against a ship the size of a moon. But Jake had noticed something. The processing ships were built for capture, not combat. Their weapons were designed to disable, not destroy. If his pilots could get inside the defensive perimeter, they might have a chance. They lost 4 fighters in the approach. The remaining 8 punched through the hull using concentrated fire, something that should not have worked against harvester armor. But these ships were different. They were softer, more vulnerable. Jake led his pilots through corridors that pulsed with organic matter, destroying everything that looked important until they found the holding chambers. Inside were thousands of captives from dozens of species. Some were Kelvani, some were Sindari, some were from species Jake had never seen. All of them were conscious and aware, kept alive while the harvesters slowly drained everything that made them who they were. The pilots rigged the transport systems to evacuate the prisoners while Jake held off the internal defenses. A Sindari reporter asked him later how he found the courage to fly into certain death. Jake thought about the question for a long time. Then he gave an answer that became famous across the galaxy. He said that humans had a saying, "No one gets left behind." It was that simple. Those people needed help. Jake could help them. So he did. The Sindari could not translate the concept. Their language had no words for the kind of loyalty that applied to strangers. But they understood the result. 5,300 beings saved from a fate worse than death because one human pilot refused to abandon them. Meanwhile, engineer Rachel Porter made a breakthrough that changed the war. She was nobody special. A technician on a research station who spent her days repairing broken equipment, but she had a gift for patterns. She could see connections that others missed. When she was assigned to analyze harvester communication signals, she found something that everyone else had overlooked. The harvesters talked to each other. Not in words, not in any way that conventional sensors could detect. But there was a pattern in their movements. A rhythm in their attacks. Rachel worked for 72 hours without sleep, mapping the pattern and building a model of their communication network. When she finally finished, the Alliance could predict enemy movements for the first time. Her Kelvani supervisor expressed concern about her health. Humans required sleep to function. Rachel just laughed and drank more coffee. She told him that humans required a lot of things. But when someone needed them, they found a way to keep going. The Alliance began winning battles. Small victories at first. A supply convoy protected. A colony evacuated in time. Then larger ones. A harvester scout force destroyed. A processing ship captured intact. Each victory was costly. Each victory was paid for in lives. But they were victories. Something the galaxy had stopped believing was possible. The harvesters did not understand what was happening. They had consumed civilizations beyond counting. They had swept through galaxies and left nothing but silence behind. Their prey was supposed to run and hide and eventually die. It was not supposed to fight back. It was not supposed to win. Marcus watched the reports coming in from across the front lines. Human officers serving alongside aliens who had once feared them. Human soldiers dying to protect beings they had never met. Human engineers and scientists and medics working themselves to exhaustion because the galaxy needed them. The prophecy had warned about humanity. It had said they were dangerous. It had said they would never stop. Now the harvesters were learning what that really meant. Humans did not stop fighting. Ever. Not when they were winning. Not when they were losing. Not even when all hope seemed lost. The Alliance was growing stronger. The tide was beginning to turn. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the harvesters felt something they had not experienced in millions of years: fear. The harvesters gathered their remaining forces for one final assault. They had learned something in the months of fighting. The alliance was strongest when it had time to prepare, when it could choose the battlefield and position its forces. So the harvesters took that advantage away. They struck at the heart of everything. Nexus Prime was the oldest station in the Concord. It was more than a military target. It was a symbol. The place where the ancient laws were kept, the chamber where species had gathered for 12,000 years to settle disputes and make peace. If Nexus Prime fell, the alliance would shatter. Every species knew it. The harvesters knew it too. Admiral Marcus Grant commanded the defense fleet from the bridge of the battleship Defiant. It was the largest human warship ever built. Constructed in secret during the darkest days of the war, its weapons were designed using knowledge gained from studying captured harvester technology. Its shields incorporated Sindari energy patterns and Kelvani engineering. It was a symbol of what the Alliance could achieve when it worked together. Marcus stood at the center of his bridge, surrounded by officers from a dozen species. Zyrith was there, the Kelvani ambassador who had first discovered the prophecy. Elder Morath had insisted on being present despite his failing health. Representatives from species that had once feared humanity now stood ready to fight beside them. The bridge crew worked together in silence, preparing for what everyone knew was coming. The harvester fleet emerged from the void like a nightmare given form. Hundreds of ships, thousands, more vessels than the Alliance had ever seen gathered in one place. At the center of the armada was the harvester flagship, a thing so massive it seemed to bend space around it. The shadows that controlled the harvesters lived within that ship. The ancient hunger that drove them to consume civilizations pulsed at its core. The battle began at dawn. If dawn had any meaning in the darkness between stars, Alliance ships moved to intercept the enemy advance. Weapons fire lit up the void in patterns that would have been beautiful if they were not so deadly. Ships died on both sides. Explosions bloomed and faded in the silence of space. Marcus gave orders calmly, directing the defense like a conductor leading an orchestra of destruction. He knew every ship in his fleet. He knew the beings who crewed them. Kelvani and Sindari and Vorthok fighting alongside humans. Species that had been enemies for generations now dying to protect each other. The prophecy had spoken of humanity, but this battle belonged to everyone. The fighting lasted 3 days, 3 days of constant combat, 3 days of ships burning and crews dying and hope slowly fading. The harvesters pushed forward relentlessly. They did not tire. They did not mourn their losses. They simply kept coming. On the second day, Jake Morrison led a desperate attack on a harvester command ship that was threatening to break through the defensive line. His squadron was down to 7 fighters. They flew into a storm of enemy fire that should have destroyed them all. 3 pilots made it through. Jake was not one of them. His fighter took a direct hit that tore through his cockpit. His last transmission was a course correction for his wingman, guiding her to the target that her sensors could no longer see. On the third day, Dr. Amy Sullivan discovered a weakness in the harvester flagship. She had been studying sensor data throughout the battle, looking for any advantage. She found it in the energy patterns around the ship's main weapon. There was a fluctuation, a moment of vulnerability when the weapon was charging. If a ship could strike at exactly the right moment, it might do real damage. She transmitted her findings to every ship in the fleet. The harvester flagship began its final approach to Nexus Prime. Its main weapon powered up, preparing to fire a shot that would destroy the station and everyone within it. Energy gathered around the massive vessel in patterns that made reality itself seem to shimmer. Colonel Linda Hayes commanded the Human Reserve Squadron. 50 ships held back for exactly this moment. She had served under Marcus for 20 years. She had watched humanity transform from a species the galaxy feared into one it depended on. She understood what was required. She broadcast her intentions across all frequencies. Every being in the fleet heard her words. She said that humanity had been given a gift. The gift of knowing that their species had a purpose. For 12,000 years, the galaxy had wondered what that purpose was. Now they knew. Humans existed to stand when others fell, to fight when others fled, to never give up, no matter the cost. Her squadron accelerated toward the Harvester flagship, 50 ships flying in perfect formation directly into the enemy's main weapon. The Harvesters tried to stop them. Point defense systems activated, smaller ships moved to intercept, but the human pilots did not waver. They had all volunteered for this. They all knew what it meant. The timing had to be perfect. Amy's calculations showed a window of exactly 2 seconds when the weapon would be vulnerable. 2 seconds out of an eternity. Linda watched the countdown on her display. She thought about her parents back on Earth. She thought about the children she had never had time to have. She thought about all the beings on Nexus Prime who would live because of what happened in the next few moments. The squadron hit the flagship's weapon array at the exact moment of vulnerability. 50 ships detonating simultaneously created an explosion that would be visible from light years away. The flagship's main weapon overloaded. The chain reaction that followed tore through the massive vessel from the inside out. The ancient shadows that controlled the Harvesters screamed in frequencies that every telepathic species in the galaxy could hear. The Harvester fleet fell into chaos. Without their command structure, the individual ships lost coordination. They began attacking each other as much as the Alliance. The remaining Alliance ships pressed their advantage, destroying enemy vessels that could no longer fight effectively. By the end of the third day, it was over. The Harvester Armada was broken. Scattered survivors fled back into the void between galaxies, where hopefully they would remain forever. Nexus Prime still stood, scarred but intact. The Alliance had won. In the aftermath, as survivors gathered amid the wreckage and debris, Elder Morath addressed the assembled species one final time. He was dying. Everyone could see it. The strain of the battle had taken everything he had left. But he had something to say. He spoke of the prophecy that had caused so much fear. He reminded them all of the warning it contained. A species born on a death world, forged in conflict. Relentless and dangerous. For 12,000 years, the galaxy had read those words and trembled. They thought the first ones were warning them against humanity. They were wrong. The first ones had seen the Harvesters coming. They had known that one day, the darkness from beyond the void would arrive. They had looked into the future and seen every species in the galaxy falling before the onslaught. All of them. Every civilization, every hope, everything ending in silence. But they had also seen something else. One species that refused to fall. One species that fought even when victory was impossible. One species that died protecting strangers and inspired others to do the same. The prophecy was not a warning against humanity. It was a promise. A promise that when the darkness came, someone would be there to stand against it. Morath turned to face the human delegation. His ancient body trembled with the effort, but his voice was strong. He thanked them. Not just for fighting, not just for dying, but for teaching the galaxy what those things meant. Humans had shown them that courage was not the absence of fear. It was the choice to stand anyway. That lesson was worth more than any victory. A monument was erected at Nexus Prime 1 year later. It showed a human hand reaching toward the stars, surrounded by hands and appendages from 100 different species reaching back. The inscription read simply, "They came from a death world. They taught us to live." Commander Daniel Carter, gray and weathered now, visited the monument with his grandchildren years after the war. The children asked him what the words meant. He looked up at the stars that humanity had fought so hard to protect. He thought about all the beings living peacefully among those stars. Kelvani, and Sindari, and Vorthak, and humans. All working together to build something better than what came before. The prophecy had been fulfilled. Humanity had stood against the darkness. They had not stood alone, but they had stood first, and in doing so, they had changed the galaxy forever. Daniel smiled at his grandchildren. He told them that the inscription meant exactly what it said. Humans came from a hard world. A dangerous world. It had made them strong. It had made them stubborn. It had made them refuse to give up even when giving up was the only sensible choice. And that stubbornness, that refusal to accept defeat, had saved everyone. The children nodded solemnly, too young to truly understand but old enough to feel the weight of the words. Above them, ships from 100 worlds passed peacefully through the stars. The darkness was gone, the harvesters were defeated, and humanity had found its place among the stars, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a promise kept at last.